If you ever find yourself working a fire lookout in the mountains, and you see another lookout tower across the valley that isn't on any map, leave. Don't radio it. Don't wave. Don't look through binoculars. And whatever you do, don't let whoever's inside know you've seen them. Because that's exactly how my first season began. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for 4 summers the first worked as a fire lookout in the mountains of central Idaho. It was supposed to be the easiest job I'd ever had. Watch the forest, report smoke, keep a weather log, stay alone. I'd always loved isolation. No traffic, no phones constantly buzzing, no neighbors, just endless trees, mountains, and the sound of the wind. My assigned tower sat on Granite Peak, nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away. The closest occupied lookout tower, according to my orientation map, was Eagle Point, 23 miles east. Too far to see with the naked eye. The Forest Service made that very clear. On my first afternoon, Ranger Collins drove me up the final service road. He was in his late 50s, quiet, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent more years in the woods than around people. After helping unload my supplies, he handed me a ring of old brass keys. "You'll be fine," he said. "Generators in the shed. Water tanks full. Radio check every evening at 6. Simple enough." Then he hesitated. "If you ever think you see another tower west of here." He stopped speaking. I waited. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Its heat shimmer. I frowned. "What?" "Just ignore it." He climbed back into his truck. That should have been the end of the conversation. Instead, just before he shut the door, he leaned back out. "And don't start counting lights after sunset." Before I could ask what he meant, he drove away. I laughed to myself. Every old ranger had strange sayings. I figured that was his. The first week passed quietly. Every morning, I checked weather instruments. Every afternoon, I scanned for smoke. Every evening, I called dispatch. Nothing unusual happened. By the 8th day, I had settled into the rhythm of the mountain. Then, just before sunset, I saw it. A lookout tower, directly across the valley. Not far away, either. Maybe 4 or 5 miles. It stood on a rocky ridge that I could have sworn had been empty every other evening. The sunlight reflected off its windows. Someone moved inside. I blinked. Still there. I grabbed the official topographic map. The ridge was marked. The tower wasn't. I checked my GPS. Nothing. Forest Service maps. Nothing. Satellite printouts. Nothing. Yet I could see it as clearly as my own tower. Smoke curled from its chimney. Whoever was inside was home. I reached for my binoculars. Then I remembered Colin's warning. "If you ever think you see another tower west of here." I lowered them. That night, during my 6 o'clock radio check, I casually asked dispatch, out of curiosity, "Is there another lookout west of Granite Peak?" There was a pause, long enough to make me wonder if I'd lost signal. Finally, the dispatcher answered, "No, I can see one." Another pause. Then, in a noticeably quieter voice, she replied, "Daniel, don't mention that over an open channel again." The transmission ended. She never gave the usual sign-off. Outside, the last sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. Across the valley, a lantern slowly lit inside the other tower. Then, just as if someone knew exactly where I was standing, another lantern appeared in the window. It flashed once, paused, then flashed twice. I had never learned Morse code, but somehow, I understood exactly what it meant. I know you can see me. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared, because I couldn't stop looking through the windows. Every 10 or 15 minutes, I'd catch myself standing in the dark, staring across the valley. The lantern was still there. Sometimes it glowed steadily. Sometimes it disappeared for several minutes before lighting again. Around midnight, I made the mistake that almost ended my first season. I picked up my binoculars, just for a second, just to prove to myself there really was another lookout tower. The lenses settled on the ridge. The tower came into perfect focus. Old timber, green metal roof, broken weather vane. Everything looked normal, until I noticed the windows. They weren't reflecting moonlight. They were too dark, like there was no glass at all. I adjusted the focus. The room inside slowly became clearer. There was furniture, a wood stove, shelves, a cot, and someone standing beside the window, watching me. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He simply stood there with one hand resting against the frame. I instinctively lowered the binoculars. My pulse hammered in my ears. When I looked up with my naked eyes, the figure was gone. Only the lantern remained. The next morning, I radioed Ranger Collins. I think I really did see another tower. Silence. Then, did you use binoculars? My stomach tightened. Yeah. He let out a slow breath. Don't do it again. You knew it was there. No. You warned me. I warned you because every lookout eventually sees it. What is it? I'll explain when I get up there. When will that be? Hopefully before it notices. The transmission ended. That answer bothered me more than anything else. Before it notices. Not before I notice. Before it notices. That afternoon, I decided to hike to the western overlook. The ridge looked close enough. Maybe a 4-hour hike. If another lookout existed, I'd find it. The trail ended after 30 minutes. Beyond it lay nothing but steep rock and dense timber. Still, I kept going. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and look across the valley. The tower stayed exactly where it had been. No closer, no farther. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, I checked my GPS. I frowned. According to the coordinates, I hadn't moved west at all. I was somehow standing less than half a mile from my own tower. I looked behind me. Granite Peak stood exactly where it should. I looked forward. The mysterious tower remained across the valley. The distance between us hadn't changed. It was impossible. I had walked for hours. The ridge should have been closer. Instead, it felt like the valley itself had stretched. A cold wind swept through the trees. Then I heard it. Metal. A slow, rhythmic clang, like someone striking an old bell. Once. Twice. 3 times. It came from the direction of the other tower. I hurried back toward Granite Peak. For the first time since taking the job, the forest felt wrong. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had gone silent. Even the wind seemed muffled. Only the bell continued. Clang, clang, clang. By the time I reached my tower, sunset had begun. The mysterious lookout was still there. Only now, smoke poured from its chimney. Too much smoke. Far too much for a small stove. It rolled into the sky in thick black columns before dissolving into nothing. Not drifting, not blowing away. Simply vanishing. At exactly 6 o'clock, dispatch called for the routine radio check. I answered. Everything sounded normal, until the dispatcher asked a strange question. Daniel, yes. Has anyone waved at you today? My mouth went dry. No. Another pause. Good. She sounded relieved. If they ever wave. Her voice cut into static. The transmission crackled violently. Then another voice broke through. Not hers. Mine. Perfectly clear. Daniel. I froze. The voice laughed softly. You finally found my tower. Every light inside my lookout flickered. The generator hadn't faltered once all summer. Now every bulb dimmed together. Outside, the lantern across the valley went dark. For several seconds, there was only darkness. Then, a new light appeared. Not in the other tower. Halfway down the mountain below mine. Someone carrying a lantern was climbing toward Granite Peak. Slowly, patiently, they stopped every few steps. And each time they stopped, they looked directly at my tower. Then continued climbing. I grabbed the binoculars without thinking. The figure was too far away to identify. Only one detail stood out. Whoever was climbing was wearing an old Forest Service fire lookout uniform, the kind that hadn't been issued in decades. The radio hissed again. This time, Ranger Collins shouted over the static. Daniel, listen carefully. Lock every door. Close every blind. And whatever you do, don't let the other lookout keeper reach your tower before sunrise. The transmission died. Outside, the lantern began moving faster. The first thing they tell you when you become a fire lookout is that loneliness can play tricks on your mind. You'll hear your own name in the wind. You'll mistake tree stumps for people. You'll swear you saw movement where nothing exists. That's what they tell every rookie. They never tell you what to do when the thing you're seeing is real. My name is Daniel Mercer, and 5 years ago, I accepted what I thought would be the easiest job of my life. One tower, one mountain, one radio, 3 months of watching for smoke in the Idaho wilderness. I took the assignment because I wanted to disappear for a while. After my divorce, I couldn't stand cities anymore. Every street reminded me of something. Every coffee shop reminded me of someone. The Forest Service job sounded perfect. Silence, distance, a chance to breathe again. The tower sat on Granite Peak, nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. From the observation room, I could see miles of untouched forest rolling across the mountains like a green ocean. During the day, golden eagles circled beneath the tower. At night, the only lights came from the stars. Or so I believed. The ranger who drove me up the mountain introduced himself as Collins. He looked like he'd spent half his life outdoors. Deep lines crossed his face, and his beard had gone almost completely gray. He barely spoke during the drive. Instead, he pointed out landmarks. North Ridge, old logging road, lightning scar. Everything sounded routine. When we finally reached the tower, he helped unload my supplies. Canned food, medical kit, fuel, weather instruments, 2 months' worth of drinking water. Before leaving, he handed me a weathered notebook. This belonged to the last lookout. I flipped through it, mostly weather observations. Cloud cover, humidity, wind speed, nothing unusual. Then Collins closed the notebook. Don't worry about the last 20 pages. What do you mean? They're not useful. His answer felt rehearsed, like he'd given it before. I looked toward the western horizon. Beautiful view. He followed my gaze. His expression changed instantly. If you ever think you see another lookout tower across that valley. He stopped. I waited. Ignore it. I laughed. There another district out there? No. Private tower? No. Then what would I be seeing? He stared at the valley for several long seconds. I don't know. That wasn't the answer that bothered me. It was the fact that he sounded honest. Before climbing into his truck, he added one last warning. If you see lights over there after sunset. He hesitated. Close your curtains. Then he drove away. I watched his truck disappear down the mountain until the trees swallowed it. By evening, I had completely dismissed his strange warning. Old mountain folklore. Nothing more. The first week passed quietly. Every morning started the same way. Coffee, weather readings, radio check, scanning the forest with binoculars. Some afternoons, I'd watch deer moving through the valleys below. Other days, I'd spot black bears wandering across distant ridges. The isolation actually felt good. For the first time in years, my mind was quiet. On the 8th evening, everything changed. The sunset was unusually clear. Orange light spilled across the mountains. I stood by the western windows, enjoying the view. That's when I noticed something reflecting sunlight. At first I assumed it was bare rock. Then the reflection moved. It wasn't rock. It was glass. I grabbed my binoculars, halfway through raising them. Colin's warning echoed in my head. If you think you see another lookout tower. I lowered them again. Instead, I squinted toward the ridge. There it was, a fire lookout, standing on a rocky summit directly across the valley. It looked old, older than mine. Dark green roof, tall windows, observation deck, exactly like every other Forest Service lookout. Except, it wasn't supposed to exist. I unfolded the official map. Every peak, every trail, every service road, every active and abandoned tower was marked. The ridge across from me had nothing, just contour lines and trees. Still, the tower remained. Smoke drifted lazily from its chimney. Someone was inside. I told myself there had to be an explanation. An old private structure, an abandoned observation platform, anything. At exactly 6 o'clock, dispatch called for the routine radio check. I answered normally. Then, trying to sound casual, I asked, "Quick question. Go ahead. There's another lookout west of Granite Peak." Silence. Long enough that I checked whether the radio had failed. Finally, the dispatcher spoke. "No, there isn't. I'm looking at one." Another pause. When she answered again, her voice had become almost a whisper. "Daniel, please don't say that over the radio again." Before I could ask why, the transmission ended. No goodbye. No sign-off. Nothing. I stared at the silent radio, then looked back toward the western ridge. The tower was still there. Only now, someone was standing in the window. They weren't moving. They weren't waving. They were simply watching my tower. watching me. As the last sunlight disappeared, a lantern lit inside their observation room. One steady yellow glow. A few seconds later, it blinked once, paused, then blinked twice. I had no idea what the signal meant, but somehow, it felt less like a greeting and more like an acknowledgement, like whoever stood inside that impossible tower had just confirmed something. They knew I had finally seen them. I stood there for what felt like an hour. The lantern never flashed again. It simply burned behind the window, perfectly still, as if whoever stood inside knew there was no longer any reason to signal. They'd already got my attention. I forced myself away from the glass. "You're letting the isolation get to you," I muttered. I made dinner, checked the weather log, read 3 chapters of an old paperback I'd brought with me. Every few minutes, I'd glance toward the western windows. The light never moved. Just before midnight, curiosity finally won. I pulled the curtains aside only an inch. The lantern was gone. The entire tower was gone. Only the empty ridgeline remained beneath the moonlight. I laughed nervously. There. I knew it. Heat shimmer. Exhaustion. Some strange trick of the evening light. Feeling foolish, I locked the tower and finally went to bed. Then something heavy landed on the roof. Thump. The sound shook the entire building. I sat upright. Silence. 5 seconds later, thump. This time it was closer to the observation room. Black bears occasionally climbed the support beams. That wasn't unusual. Still, Forest Service protocol required checking. I grabbed my flashlight, opened the trapdoor leading to the roof hatch. The ladder creaked beneath my boots. The wind hit me the moment I climbed outside. Cold, sharp. The roof was empty. No bear, no fallen branch, nothing. I slowly swept the flashlight across the rooftop. Nothing. Then I noticed something that made every hair on my arm stand up. Boot prints. Fresh. They crossed the roof from one edge to the other. The strange part wasn't that someone had been there. It was where the prints ended. They stopped at the western edge of the roof. Beyond them, nothing. No ladder. No climbing marks. No tracks leading away. Just empty air overlooking a 600-foot drop. I backed away from the edge. My breathing had become shallow. Someone had walked across my roof and disappeared. I didn't sleep again that night. At sunrise, I radioed Ranger Collins. He answered immediately. "You sound terrible. I found footprints." "Where?" "On my roof." Silence. Then he asked one question. "Did they lead toward the west?" "Yeah." He sighed. "I'll be there tomorrow." "Tomorrow? You'll be fine for one more night." "I don't think I will." His voice hardened. "Listen carefully. I'm only saying this once. If you see the other tower again, do not acknowledge it." "What does that mean?" "No waving. No flashlight. No binoculars. No radio. No photographs. If they think you can see them." He stopped. "What happens?" His answer came quietly. "They start trying to see you." The transmission ended. That afternoon, I searched every inch of the lookout. Everything appeared normal. Generator, fuel, food, weather equipment. Nothing missing. Then I opened the old notebook Collins had given me, the one that belonged to the previous lookout. I skipped past the weather logs, toward the pages Collins had told me not to read. The handwriting changed abruptly. The neat block letters became shaky, uneven, almost frantic. July 18th. Saw it again. Closer tonight. July 19th. Dispatch says there's no tower. They're lying. July 20th. It flashed first. I shouldn't have flashed back. My pulse quickened. I turned another page. July 21st. Someone watched me through binoculars. Looked exactly like me. I stopped reading. The silence inside the tower suddenly felt overwhelming. I slowly looked toward the western windows. Empty. No tower. I exhaled. Then, the radio crackled by itself. Not the usual burst of static. A voice. Weak. Broken. Granite Peak. I grabbed the microphone. "This is Granite Peak." No response. Only static. Then the voice returned. "Can you hear me?" It sounded distorted, as if the speaker stood underwater. "This is Daniel. Identify yourself." Several seconds passed. Finally, "Daniel." I frowned. "What?" "It's you." I spread through my chest. The voice continued. "I'm across the valley." I stared at the radio. This isn't funny. You don't have much time. Static swallowed half the sentence. They'll make you wave. I slammed the radio off. The speaker went silent. My own reflection stared back at me in the dark glass of the window. Except, it wasn't matching me anymore. I wasn't moving. But my reflection slowly turned its head toward the western ridge. Then it smiled. I spun around. The room behind me was empty. When I looked back at the window, my reflection was normal again. Shaking, I stepped outside for air. The sun had almost set. Golden light stretched across the valley. And there, exactly where it had been the evening before, the impossible lookout stood once more. Only this time, there wasn't one figure inside. There were two. One stood in the observation room. The other stood on the balcony. Both were looking directly at my tower. Then, slowly, the one on the balcony raised its arm. Not to wave, to point, directly at me.